We're about a quarter of the way through the NBA season, and the Toronto Raptors have not been great. They're currently 9-11 despite essentially bringing back the same roster as last year, albeit replacing Fred VanVleet with Dennis Schroer. That doesn't sound that bad on paper. They were 9-11 in 2022, and they ended up making the playoffs, almost winning 50 games. That said, there are some warning signs that this season will not be a repeat of how Toronto turned things around like they did in Scottie's rookie season, but we'll get to that later. Before we do, let's get into some general observations of the Raptors season thus far.
Levert attacking, and the help D comes from Scotty B.
It almost feels pointless to talk about how good Scotty Barnes has been to start this season. Everyone has been talking about the improvements he's been making on both ends of the floor. He's in conversations for most improved player, even if it feels like the media has been waiting to give it to Tyrese Maxey for like 2 seasons. And he's the main reason why there's any optimism for this team, despite the front office's reluctance to make Scotty, the guy. Pascal Siakam may still be the best player on the team, but Barnes is closing that gap immensely quick, at least in the games where he's not third in touches, but we'll get to that. His help defense and intensity in general on defense is on point. His outside shooting is both brimming in confidence and accuracy, as he's shooting a career-high 38.2% on 5 attempts per game, and in general he's just become a much more complete player. He does have some nights where the aggression is toned down, but those tend to be games where one of his teammates have got a hot hand. When they don't step up, or it's the fourth quarter, he does. As I'm recording this, we're coming off of a loss to the Knicks where he dropped 29 points during an immensely cool night from OG Anunoby, who went 4-13. Scotty Barnes did his part despite the loss. Barnes' playmaking is excellent as always, which makes it a shame that a lot of the good looks that he generated for his teammates haven't translated to increased scoring overall. But that's not really his fault. Scottie Barnes has been fantastic, and it's a good thing too, because
Siakam! Oh! You're seeing buckets, Jack!
Look, we all saw the press conference where Malachi Flynn talked about Pascal Siakam's extension with this response in regards to said extension.
We do believe that a lot of our players didn't play the right way last year, and we want to see them play the right way. I said it that we were selfish. I'm not running away from that. We were selfish and we did not play the right way. So let us see it when we play the right way.
A big yikes, yeah. We know that they tried to trade him on draft night. We know the Pacers and Hawks had packages lined up for him in the offseason that fell through due to Pascal wanting to resign with only Toronto. Whether it's Bobby Webster or Malachi Flynn, whenever they say that
we do believe in Pascal,
they could say that all they want. I don't believe them. It is not a secret that Siakam will be on a different team by the end of the season, and the only reason that I could possibly see him not being on another team is because the offers have been menial enough that they decided it's better to resign him and try next off-season. Or if he won't be available to trade in the off-season, then the earliest possible date. Much like Scotty Barnes, it feels almost pointless to talk about Pascal Siakam given that circumstance. Although with Pascal Siakam there is one notable thing. He is shooting truly the worst in his career from 3 that we have ever seen. And yes, technically he shot a worse percentage in his rookie season, but that was on incredibly low volume. He is shooting sub 20% from a significantly higher volume. And while Scottie's touches have gone down throughout the season, Pascal's has only gone up, which, to be fair, again, he is the best player on the team. And side note, it's not Pascal Siakam's job to get a good return in a trade for Pascal Siakam, and this is Bobby Webster who is at fault because he was not decisive at last year's deadline, or for that matter, failing to get any sort of deal done on draft night. Like, yes, Pascal's decision may have affected those, but, he had plenty of time to trade him before then, instead of trading for Jakob Poeltl, and making it so we have to compete this year because, top 6 protected. Outside of his shooting from 3 being just truly abysmal, Pascal is being Pascal and doing Pascal things. You can't really complain about it, but you do wonder how much longer he will be on the team, and it really is a shame how this front office has treated him throughout the years. He had a really slow start, but you expected him to pick things up, and he certainly has.
Comes to Pascal, here's Schroer, attacking, plus the foul!
I was not a fan of the Dennis Schroer signing when it came out first. I did not think he was a good fit for the team, let alone a good replacement for Fred VanVleet, especially with Schroer being a significantly worse shooter, even if one could argue that he's more consistent on a night-to-night basis. So, color me surprised that the Schroer signing has turned out to be one of, if not the best free agent signing in Raptors history. Sad a statement as that may be, because your competition is, Bismack Biyombo? But yeah, for an MLE signing, Dennis Schroer has been great. He's averaging nearly 16 points, 3 rebounds, and 7 assists, with less than 2 turnovers per game. His shooting started out really hot, but he's come down to a more cool 35.3% from 3, which is still one of the better outside shooting seasons of his career. That said, while Schroer was a good signing in a vacuum, the problem is that these decisions don't exist in one, and this team is going to have a gaping hole at the point guard position in a couple of years unless the plan is for Scotty Barnes to eventually shift to that position. Dennis Schroer is not exactly a whippersnapper, as the kids would say. He's 30 years old, and assuming Dennis isn't traded or leaves next year, or traded at this year's deadline for that matter, it is almost certain that he will decline to some extent by the time that Scotty Barnes reaches his prime. This is part of the reason why I'm a bit worried about the transition over to the Scotty Barnes era, because I seriously question whether this front office is going to A, surround him with the correct talent, and B, do so in a manner that actually lines up with his timeline. It took the front office years to put together a competent supporting cast around DeMar, Lowry, and Valanciunas, and bear in mind, this was after they had several winning seasons despite their failures. They ended in first-round flameouts, most infamously that sweep by the Wizards, but they were winning a lot of games in the regular season. Right now, the talent, or at least the veteran talent, that the Raptors have surrounded Scotty with, aside from OG Anunoby, it either doesn't complement his strengths, i.e. Jakob Poeltl's complete lack of outside shooting, or they don't line up with his timeline like Dennis Schroer. And because this is going to be Scotty's team, well, it's hard not to question whether or not this front office is actually going to succeed at giving him the supporting cast that he needs. So credit where it's due, Schroer has been a decent budget replacement for Fred, especially considering how much Fred got paid, but he's not the long-term solution to the point guard problem. Speaking of point guards,
swing to Tobias. Oh, he wants to clear out against Malachi Flynn. Raptors stay loaded. Flynn gets a hand on it and rips it away. ISO me, will ya?
The stats don't tell the story with Malachi Flynn. Well, they do, but it's complicated. Malachi Flynn has been the exception to the rule for the Raptors of late, specifically their development success. Most of the Raptors' late first rounders since Masai and Bobby have taken over have developed into starter caliber players at worst. At best, you're looking at an all-NBA player like Pascal Siakam. Then there's Malachi Flynn, who hasn't shown anything notable outside of 1 month in the season that every Raptors fan wants to forget, aside from, the draft. At least until this season, where Malachi is playing with a level of confidence that doesn't show up on the stat sheet. He's consistently engaged on defense, he's handling the ball relatively well, his shooting still isn't great, but he doesn't look scared to take a shot anymore, and he's a lot more willing to drive into the paint. He's still not a top-tier bench point guard. If you were given the option to choose him, Davion Mitchell, DeLon, or Andrew Nembhard, you'd take one of those guys over Flynn unless you're his Facebook-loving father, but he has become playable, and that is worthy of note. Considering how it looked like Flynn might be out of the league in a year, one can't help but appreciate that he has taken steps towards becoming a much better player. A lot of that improvement can be attributed to...
And I love your hands there. I love hands.
Evaluating coaches is really, really hard. There's a lot to the job that one doesn't see, and especially for a rookie head coach, there's a lot of growing pains involved on the coaching side, just as much as it is for the players, as it takes time for them to buy into their roles under a new system, let alone under the .5 offense that Darko is trying to implement, while still preserving the Raptors' gritty defensive identity. It's been a mixed bag so far. They're 12th in defense, which, while a drop down compared to last year, is not bad whatsoever considering how many games that OG Anunoby has missed to start the season that make up the current sample size. The offense, well, it looks better. The ball is moving more, but while there's a lot more passing going on and a lot more ball movement, the makes are anything but consistent. As such, the Raptors only barely escape having a bottom 5 offense by being the 7th worst offense this season with the 10th worst shooting percentage amongst teams, averaging 54.4%. Still, it is more watchable, so good job, Darko. That said, there have been some concrete concerns. The Raptors have gone 5-9 against 500 or higher teams, and they've started to form a bad habit of giving up big leads by the first half. They've also developed a habit of clawing their way back into the game, and not like the fake comebacks from last season. Their overtime win versus the Spurs is one of the largest comebacks in Raptors history. And the Wizards game, despite the fact that you should not be down as much as you were against this year's Wizards team, ranks high up there too. Which is why hearing that your head coach is telling the players to have fun during halftime because he doesn't think that they're going to win? That's weird. That's incredibly weird when you're trying to build a winning culture. That's incredibly weird to hear that your coach does not have the faith in you to win this game. Rajakovic has also had some questionable rotations and less successful lineups, mainly the Scottie or OG Anunoby plus 4 bench unit lineups, as well as some weird choices for when he decides to pull Scottie in the fourth quarter, but I can't blame him too much for how bad these units have been. Rajakovic's tenure has not been some all-time great start to a coaching career, but he's working with what he's got. Which brings us to...
Corner 3, Boucher from Montreal.
So yeah, the Raptors went into the season with the same roster, more or less intact. That level of continuity is what makes it unsurprising that the bench is, once again, amongst the worst in the entire league. It is shallow, poorly constructed, and wholly lacking in guard play, to say nothing of reliable ball handlers. As of this writing, the Raptors bench is currently 23rd in points per game at 30.4, which doesn't sound that bad, until you realize that the difference between them and the worst bench of this season, the Chicago Bulls, is a mere 2.2 points. Now, in theory, having a weak bench isn't the end of the world if you have a starting unit that can just absolutely clobber the opposing team. The 2023 Nuggets got average offensive production from their bench players, and they won the whole thing. In practice, well, there's no one on the Raptors who currently is as good as Nikola Jokic, and the Raptors bench's lack of offensive production has only further exposed significant issues with the roster's construction, namely the lack of three-point shooting and positional redundancy. As a team, the Toronto Raptors are shooting a paltry 33.7% from 3, and their bench is only marginally worse with an abysmal 32.7%. They don't complement the starter's strengths, and as of right now, they're not racking up points to ease the load of the starting unit, which, as a result, the minutes have started slowly creeping up for the starting 5 to make up for those oft quiet nights where the bench's shots aren't falling. It looks slightly better when you dive into the individual players, or at least the top performers. It drops off pretty hard after the 7th, arguably 8th man. Chris Boucher has quietly had one of his better shooting seasons, but it's on very low volume. He isn't even taking an average of 2 threes a game. He is always bringing energy off the bench, and he fills his role quite well. The problem is that said role overlaps with the 2 other energy bigs off the bench. Now, granted, Boucher has his faults, namely on defense, where he's still biting on obvious pump fakes, but those other players are less refined than Boucher, even if one of them has arguably higher potential than him. Precious Achiuwa is still wildly inconsistent on offense, and in general, if we're being completely honest. And Jalen McDaniels has been so bad that I almost forgot that he was on the team until Darko Rajakovic put him back in the rotation for the Suns game. It took him around 5 games to make a single field goal. The signing and free agency looked good at the time, but it has not panned out so far. His defense hasn't even been that good. The only one of the bench forwards who isn't redundant, Otto Porter Jr., for some reason is barely getting played despite him being arguably the best shooter off the bench, aside from Gary Trent Jr. Like, yes, he's made of glass, and yes, the Raptors have had a lot of back-to-backs to start the season that you presumably don't want him playing both games of, but they could have had him playing more than 9 games, which, fun fact, that's more games than he played all of last season, albeit due to injury. As for the guards and centers, there's barely anyone to talk about, once again, due to the roster construction favoring lengthy forwards far too heavily, and once again leading to a major issue of the team's generally poor ball handling and inability to orchestrate the offense. That and Christian Koloko has been injured to start the season and has not played a single game. As for who has played, I've already mentioned Malachi Flynn, but Gary Trent Jr. has been a mixed bag off of the bench so far, part of which was due to an injury which cost him a couple of games. Mostly it's due to his skill set not being conducive to being played in the 4 bench players, 1 starter lineups that Darko loves to feel, because Gary is being asked to create for himself far more than he's capable of, at least currently so. That said, it's not a complete surprise that he struggled coming off of the bench so far, because that was an issue he had last season when we acquired Jakob Poeltl, albeit his shooting splits look far worse to his six-man-esque role at the end of the 2023 season. It is by far the worst shooting splits he's had as a Raptor. In particular, his free throw shooting has been shockingly bad. Actually, side note, what is with the Raptors not being able to make their free throws this season? I'm not going to go through every player, but if you look at their individual free throw percentages, almost every player is either the same or has regressed. Almost every player has either regressed or stayed the same, with the former being far more likely than the latter. If your name isn't Scotty Barnes or Dennis Schroer, you got worse of the line to some extent, and I cannot wrap my head around this being a team issue, because it has cost the Raptors multiple games up to this point. Anyway, tangent over, teams still do have to respect the possibility of Gary getting hot. I still believe in Gary Trent Jr., he's only 24 years old after all, but he needs to look more like he did in 2022 than 2023, because there's only so much one can attribute his current problems to adjusting to a new role, let alone a potential shooting slump. Oh, and Thad Young is collecting DMPs like they're Pokemon cards. So glad we traded a first-round pick for him. I'm not surprised that the bench has been bad, it's more or less the same unit as the prior season. But without any notable improvements to their younger players, it's become more and more clear that the Raptors' most significant issue as of late is the level of talent on the team, and the front office's inability to either draft or develop them as of late, at least to the same extent that they did with the bench mob, many of whom went on to become key contributors to the team's first championship. And speaking of the draft,
His first professional charge taken.
You gotta love it.
So unlike a lot of Raptor fans right now, I'm not worried about Grady Dick. In theory, he complements Scottie well as a shooter, he was an absolute sniper in college, and he's shown some of his potential as a passer on the court, as well as some solid slashing that he was known for in high school, but he hasn't been great. Mostly it's the shooting, regardless of whether or not the Raptors have tried to change his shot form, which is its own discussion. The fact of the matter is that he hasn't been making his shots. He's probably the worst defender on the roster right now, unless you count the corpse of Thad Young, and in his last few games with the team, his confidence looks like it was decimated. He looks like Malachi Flynn did last season, like he's afraid to shoot. Like I said, I'm not worried about Grady Dick just yet, he's only played 15 games. He's currently in the G League, where he most recently had a great game against the Maine Celtics, racking up 22 points and making most of his threes. It's way too early to call him a bust, but it's hard not to be disappointed in Dick's play so far, considering how guys like Keontae George and Jordan Hawkins have been immediate contributors for their respective teams, both of whom were available for the Raptors to draft at 13. Granted, they were given more of a runway given their teams' respective circumstances. The Raptors have a serious need for snipers on the roster, whether it be the bench or starting lineup, and while Grady can offer that in theory, in practice it's been pretty rough, and that's the season in general. It's been rough. It hasn't been the absolute slog that the last season was. I've been enjoying it a lot more than I was last season, or for that matter the Tampa season, but it very much feels like the Raptors are treading water this season, solely because of their indecisiveness at last year's deadline. Let's just hope, regardless of what the team's record may be, that they don't make the same mistake at this year's deadline. But until then, and until next time, game on my friends.